Welcome back to the Biblical Mystery Channel. Today's new story is the story of Mephibosheth, the last heir of Saul's kingdom. Please support the channel with a like and subscribe. The content of this video has been carefully compiled from various sources, so if there are any missing details or inaccuracies, please feel free to leave a comment and share your additional insights. Thank you. And now, let's begin the story.
What if one of the most powerful stories of grace in the entire Bible isn't about a king, a prophet, or a warrior, but about a forgotten man hiding in exile? A man born into royalty, crippled by tragedy, and expected to die because of who his grandfather was. His name was Mephibosheth. For years, he lived in the shadows of a fallen dynasty, carrying the weight of a family name that had become a political liability. Then one day, a message arrived from King David. In the ancient world, that kind of summons usually meant only one thing: judgment. But what happened next would become one of the most unexpected and profound moments in biblical history. This is the complete story of Mephibosheth, a story of loss, loyalty, brokenness, covenant, and a grace that changed everything. To understand the story of Mephibosheth, we must begin before the accident that changed his life, before the years of exile in Lo-debar, and before the famous meeting with King David. His story starts during one of the most important transitions in Israel's history, a period when the nation was learning what it meant to live under a monarchy. For generations, Israel had been governed by judges, tribal leaders raised up during times of crisis. That changed when the people demanded a king. According to the biblical record, Saul became the first ruler of a united Israel, establishing a royal court and creating the foundations of a centralized kingdom. His reign marked the beginning of a new political era, one in which questions of succession, dynastic stability, and royal authority became increasingly important. It was into this world that Mephibosheth was born. His father was Jonathan, the eldest son of Saul, and the man most Israelites would have expected to inherit the throne. Unlike many ancient crown princes, remembered primarily for political ambition, Jonathan earned a reputation as a courageous military leader. The books of Samuel describe him leading daring operations against the Philistines and displaying a level of confidence in God that distinguished him even within Israel's military leadership. From a political standpoint, Jonathan represented the future of Saul's dynasty. If events followed the normal pattern of royal succession, the kingdom would eventually pass from Saul to Jonathan, and then to Jonathan's descendants. Mephibosheth therefore entered a family positioned at the center of Israel's future. Yet the most influential relationship in Jonathan's life was not with his father. It was with David. Their friendship remains one of the most remarkable relationships recorded in the Old Testament, because it developed under circumstances that usually produced rivalry rather than loyalty. David's military victories had made him increasingly popular throughout Israel. More importantly, the prophet Samuel had already anointed him as the future king. In many royal courts across the ancient Near East, the rise of a rival claimant would have created suspicion, factional conflict, or violence. Jonathan responded differently. Instead of treating David as a threat, he recognized the role David would play in Israel's future and formed a covenant relationship with him. That decision would eventually shape the destiny of Jonathan's son more than either man could have imagined. While these larger political developments unfolded, tensions within Saul's reign continued to grow. Early successes gave way to instability. The biblical narrative describes repeated acts of disobedience that damaged Saul's relationship with God and weakened confidence in his leadership. At the same time, Philistine pressure remained a constant challenge along Israel's borders. The kingdom was still young, its institutions were still developing, and its future remained uncertain. Modern readers often know how the story ends, but people living during Saul's reign could not see what was coming. To them, the royal family still represented continuity and national leadership. From that perspective, a child born into Jonathan's household would have appeared to possess a secure future. The significance of Mephibosheth's birth, therefore, lies not in anything he personally accomplished, but in the world into which he arrived. He was born at the intersection of two stories already moving toward collision. One story involved the gradual decline of Saul's dynasty. The other involved the rise of David. At first, those developments seemed unrelated to the life of a young child growing up within the royal household. Yet, they would eventually determine almost every major event he experienced. The books of Samuel repeatedly demonstrate how national events shape individual lives, and few characters illustrate that reality more clearly than Mephibosheth. Long before he made any choices of his own, powerful forces were already reshaping the future around him. Kings were making decisions. Armies were preparing for war. Alliances were forming. Political loyalties were shifting. What appeared to be a stable kingdom was moving toward a crisis that would alter the course of Israel's history. Years later, readers would remember Mephibosheth as the disabled son of Jonathan who sat at David's table at the beginning of the story. However, none of those details existed. There was only a child growing up within Israel's first royal dynasty, unaware that the foundations beneath that dynasty were beginning to crack. The events that would define his life had not yet happened, but the conditions that made them possible were already in place. In the ancient world, entire kingdoms could change direction in a single generation. Soon, the house of Saul would discover just how quickly that change could come. The future that once appeared secure for Saul's family was tested on the battlefield. During the final years of Saul's reign, the Philistines remained Israel's most dangerous rival. For generations, conflicts between the two peoples had shaped the political landscape of the region. The Philistines controlled important coastal territories, possessed experienced military forces, and repeatedly challenged Israel's attempts to establish long-term security. By the time Mephibosheth was still a young child, tensions between the two sides had once again escalated into open warfare. The decisive confrontation took place near Mount Gilboa, a mountainous area overlooking the Jezreel Valley, one of the most strategically important regions in ancient Israel. The biblical account in 1 Samuel 31 presents the battle as a disaster for Israel. Saul's army was defeated. The defensive lines collapsed, and the royal family found itself directly exposed to the enemy. Among those fighting that day was Jonathan. For years, he had distinguished himself as one of Israel's most capable military leaders. His courage had become part of national memory through campaigns that demonstrated both tactical skill and personal faith. Yet, military reputation could not alter the outcome of the battle at Gilboa. Jonathan was killed alongside his brothers as Philistine forces overwhelmed the Israelite position. The death of the crown prince immediately created a succession crisis. The man expected to inherit Saul's throne was gone. The future of the dynasty suddenly became uncertain. The situation deteriorated further when Saul himself was seriously wounded. According to the biblical narrative, the king realized capture was imminent. Concerned about falling into Philistine hands and facing humiliation at the hands of his enemies, he died on the battlefield. With Saul's death, Israel lost its first king. Within a single day, both the ruler of the nation and his designated successor had disappeared from the political stage. In the ancient world, such events rarely remained isolated military losses. A defeated army could be rebuilt. A lost battle could eventually be avenged. The death of a ruling king and his heir carried different consequences. It created a vacuum at the center of power. Questions emerged immediately. Who would govern? Who would command the army? Who would preserve order? Royal households often became vulnerable during these moments because political uncertainty encouraged fear, opportunism, and instability. Historical records from across the ancient Near East demonstrate that transitions of power frequently produced chaos, especially when they occurred unexpectedly during wartime. It is against this backdrop that one brief detail in Scripture becomes so significant. Years later, 2 Samuel 4 records a fact that explains why Mephibosheth spent the rest of his life disabled. When news arrived that Saul and Jonathan had died, his nurse took him and fled. The text offers no lengthy explanation because ancient readers likely understood the situation immediately. The collapse of a ruling dynasty created genuine danger for surviving family members, whether the threat came from invading forces, local unrest, or uncertainty about future political developments. Remaining in place no longer seemed safe. The nurse acted quickly because she believed delay carried risks. During the hurried escape, however, an accident occurred. Mephibosheth fell and suffered an injury that permanently affected both of his feet. The Bible does not provide medical details, and scholars can only speculate about the exact nature of the injury. What the text makes clear is that the consequences remained for the rest of his life. This moment deserves attention because it illustrates how major historical events often become personal tragedies. Military historians can analyze troop movements, political transitions, and strategic failures. The biblical narrative narrows the focus to a child whose life was altered by circumstances completely beyond his control. Mephibosheth did not participate in the battle. He made none of the decisions that led to it. He was too young to influence the fate of the kingdom. Nevertheless, the outcome of Mount Gilboa would shape every chapter of his future. In a matter of hours, he lost his father, lost his grandfather, lost the protection of the royal household, and suffered a life-changing injury. The significance of that injury becomes even clearer when viewed within the realities of the ancient world. Modern societies provide accommodations, medical support, and infrastructure that did not exist in antiquity. Physical disabilities often imposed substantial limitations on mobility, employment, military participation, and social standing. For a child born into the royal family, the contrast between expectation and reality became especially dramatic. The grandson of a king now faced challenges that would accompany him for the rest of his life. More importantly, the identity others attached to him would begin to change. He was no longer viewed simply as Jonathan's son. He became a surviving member of a defeated dynasty. The battle at Mount Gilboa, therefore, represents far more than a military defeat recorded in Israel's history. It marks the dividing line between two phases of Mephibosheth's life. Everything associated with his early years belonged to a world that no longer existed. The royal court, the certainty of succession, and the stability of Saul's household disappeared on that battlefield. What followed would not be life in a palace, but life in exile. While David's rise to power gradually transformed the future of the kingdom, Jonathan's son was carried away from the center of events toward a place that would remain almost invisible to history for many years. That place was called Lo-Debar, after the disaster at Mount Gilboa. The biblical narrative follows the rise of David while saying almost nothing about Jonathan's son. This silence is significant. In the books of Samuel, major figures often disappear from the record when they no longer influence national events, and for many years Mephibosheth belonged to that category. The next time Scripture identifies his location, he is living in Lo-Debar, a settlement east of the Jordan River, in the broader region of Gilead. Although the Bible provides only a handful of references to the place, its location helps explain why it became a suitable refuge during a period of political transition. Lo-debar stood well away from the centers of royal administration that would eventually develop around David's rule. For someone connected to the former dynasty, distance offered a degree of security. Geography often shaped survival in the ancient world, and regions beyond the Jordan frequently served as places of refuge during times of instability. By the time Mephibosheth settled there, Israel itself was undergoing major changes. Saul's death had not immediately produced a unified kingdom under David. The transition unfolded in stages. David first ruled in Hebron over Judah, while other parts of Israel remained connected to Saul's surviving supporters. Only after years of political developments, negotiations, and conflict did David emerge as king over a united nation. This broader historical context is important because it reminds us that Mephibosheth's years in Lo-debar coincided with one of the most consequential periods in Israel's political history. While leadership structures were being reshaped and a new royal administration was taking form, Jonathan's son remained outside those developments. The biblical text also identifies the household in which he lived. According to 2 Samuel 9, he stayed in the house of Heir, son of Amiel. This detail may seem minor, but it provides an important glimpse into daily reality. Mephibosheth was not wandering alone or surviving in complete isolation. He lived under the protection of another family. Ancient societies relied heavily on networks of kinship, patronage, and hospitality, particularly when individuals faced economic or physical vulnerability. As someone living with a disability and carrying the legacy of a fallen royal house, Mephibosheth likely depended upon support systems that helped sustain him through years of uncertainty. The presence of Machir suggests that his survival was connected not only to political circumstances, but also to the faithfulness of ordinary people, whose names rarely receive extended attention in biblical history. One of the challenges historians face when studying figures like Mephibosheth is the limited amount of information available. Scripture does not describe his daily routines, personal ambitions, or emotional struggles during these years. Responsible interpretation, therefore, requires caution. It is tempting to fill the silence with speculation, but the text itself points readers toward larger themes. One of those themes concerns the unpredictable nature of political fortune. In the ancient Near East, membership in a royal family could provide extraordinary privilege during one generation and create vulnerability in the next. Dynasties rose and fell with surprising speed. The same family that once occupied a throne could suddenly find itself dependent upon the protection of others. Mephibosheth's circumstances illustrate that reality with unusual clarity. His story reflects how closely personal lives were connected to larger historical developments. Another important aspect of this period involves David's growing consolidation of power. As his kingdom expanded, he achieved military victories against neighboring peoples, established Jerusalem as his capital, and strengthened the institutions of government. These developments occupy a significant portion of the biblical narrative because they shaped the future of Israel. Interestingly, the text never presents Mephibosheth as participating in opposition to David during these years. No rebellion is associated with his name. No attempt to revive Saul's dynasty is attributed to him. The narrative simply leaves him in Lo-debar, while the kingdom evolves around him. This observation becomes important later because it provides context for the accusations that will eventually be made against him during Absalom's rebellion. At this stage of the story, however, there is no indication that Jonathan's son played any active role in political affairs. The significance of Lo-debar, therefore, lies less in what happened there and more in what it represents within the narrative. It marks a long interval between catastrophe and restoration. Many biblical stories focus on dramatic events, decisive battles, prophetic encounters, or royal decisions. The years spent in Lo-debar belong to a different category. They remind readers that history is often shaped not only by public moments, but also by extended periods that receive little attention. Entire chapters of a person's life may pass without visible change, even while larger developments are unfolding beyond their control. For Mephibosheth, those years formed the bridge between the collapse of Saul's household and the unexpected opportunity that would later emerge from David's court. By the time David had firmly established his kingdom, Jonathan's son had spent much of his life away from the political center of Israel. Nothing in the biblical record suggests that he expected his circumstances to change. The surviving heir of Saul's family had become a largely forgotten figure in national affairs. Yet one connection from the past remained alive. Long before Mount Gilboa, long before Lo-debar, and long before David sat securely on Israel's throne, a covenant had been established between two young men whose friendship had survived political division. The next phase of Mephibosheth's story begins not with a military campaign or a royal decree, but with David remembering a promise that time had not erased. By the time Mephibosheth was living in Lo-debar, David had become one of the most powerful rulers in the region. The years of uncertainty that followed Saul's death had largely passed. Jerusalem had been established as the capital. Military victories had expanded Israel's influence. The kingdom possessed a level of stability that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. From a political perspective, David no longer needed to think about the fallen house of Saul. The transition of power had already occurred. New institutions were functioning. New alliances had been formed, and a new royal dynasty was taking shape. Yet one part of David's past remained connected to the family that had once occupied the throne before him. That connection was Jonathan. Few relationships in the Hebrew Bible receive as much attention as the friendship between David and Jonathan. What makes their relationship remarkable is not simply its emotional depth, but the circumstances under which it developed. Jonathan was the son of the reigning king and the most obvious candidate to inherit the throne. David was the young warrior whose growing popularity increasingly threatened that expectation. Throughout the ancient Near East, such situations often produced rivalry. Royal succession was rarely a peaceful subject. Families competed for influence. Factions formed around competing claims, and political survival sometimes depended on removing potential challengers. Against that backdrop, the friendship between Jonathan and David appears extraordinary. Rather than treating David as a rival, Jonathan consistently acted in ways that protected him. Several episodes in the books of Samuel illustrate this pattern. Jonathan warned David when Saul sought his life. He intervened on David's behalf during periods of escalating tension. He repeatedly demonstrated loyalty, even when doing so placed him in a difficult position with his own father. These actions reveal something important about Jonathan's character. He understood that David's future role in Israel was larger than personal ambition or political competition. The biblical narrative presents Jonathan as a man willing to place faithfulness above self-interest, even when the consequences affected his own position within the royal family. One of the most significant moments in their relationship occurred when they formalized their commitment to one another. In the world of the Old Testament, such agreements carried far greater weight than casual promises. They established enduring obligations that shaped future behavior and created expectations extending beyond immediate circumstances. This helps explain why several passages in 1 Samuel include discussions about the treatment of future descendants. Jonathan was fully aware of the uncertainties surrounding Israel's future. He understood that dynasties rise and fall. He understood that political transitions often place surviving family members at risk. His concern, therefore, extended beyond his own lifetime. He wanted assurance that his family would not be forgotten if David eventually became king. David agreed. At the time, neither man could know how dramatically history would unfold. Mount Gilboa still lay in the future. Saul's death had not yet occurred. Mephibosheth was either very young or had not yet been born. The conversation was rooted in trust, rather than detailed knowledge of future events. This detail is important because it highlights the nature of commitment in the biblical narrative. The value of a promise is often measured long after it is made. Anyone can make generous commitments when circumstances are favorable. The true test arrives when honoring those commitments requires effort, sacrifice, or deliberate remembrance. Years passed after Jonathan's death. During that time, David experienced events that might easily have pushed earlier obligations into the background. He survived wars, governed a growing kingdom, managed political challenges, and established a new dynasty. Most rulers facing such responsibilities would naturally focus on immediate concerns rather than relationships from previous generations. Yet, the biblical text presents David differently. At a certain point during his reign, he began asking a question that revealed the enduring influence of his friendship with Jonathan. According to 2 Samuel 9, David asked whether anyone remained from Saul's family to whom kindness could still be shown for Jonathan's sake. The wording deserves attention. David was not searching for military support. He was not conducting a political census. He was not attempting to neutralize potential threats. His inquiry began with the intention to show kindness. This distinction becomes even more striking when viewed within its historical context. Ancient kings sometimes remembered former rivals because they posed dangers. David remembered Jonathan because he valued a relationship that had shaped his life long before he wore a crown. The search that followed eventually led to information about a surviving son. For years, Jonathan's family had remained outside the center of national affairs. The grandson of Saul was living beyond the Jordan River, in a place few would have associated with royal influence. Nothing in the narrative suggests that Mephibosheth expected contact from Jerusalem. As far as the historical record reveals, he had spent much of his adult life away from the political stage. David, however, had not forgotten the obligations created decades earlier. The significance of this moment lies not only in what David remembered, but also in what he chose to do next. Remembering a promise is one thing. Acting upon it is another. The king's next decision would bring a man from the margins of Israelite society directly into the presence of the most powerful ruler in the nation. For Mephibosheth, the message that soon arrived from Jerusalem would be impossible to ignore. The question was not whether he would answer the king's summons. The question was what the king wanted from him. David's search eventually produced a name. The surviving son of Jonathan had been located. According to 2 Samuel 9, Mephibosheth was living in the house of Heir, son of Amiel, in Lo-Debar, beyond the Jordan River. Once that information reached Jerusalem, David acted immediately. Messengers were sent, and Jonathan's son was summoned to appear before the king. The biblical account describes the event in only a few verses, but the historical context helps explain why this moment marked a major turning point in Mephibosheth's life. For years, he had lived outside the centers of power that shaped the kingdom. Suddenly, the king himself was requesting his presence. In the ancient Near East, a royal summons carried enormous significance. Kings did not typically invite private citizens to appear before them without a reason. Such requests demanded attention because they originated from the highest level of authority in the land. The recipient was rarely in a position to decline. More importantly, the purpose of the summons was often unknown until the meeting itself occurred. Modern readers sometimes underestimate how unusual Mephibosheth's situation was. He was not merely another subject of the kingdom. He was a surviving descendant of a previous royal dynasty. Throughout the ancient world, changes in dynastic power often created long-term concerns regarding legitimacy and succession, even when no active challenge existed. the descendants of former rulers could attract attention simply because of their family connections. Historical records from neighboring civilizations contain numerous examples of royal families being monitored, restricted, or removed after political transitions. This does not mean David intended such actions. In fact, the narrative will soon reveal the opposite. Nevertheless, the broader political realities of the period help explain why a summons from the king could not be viewed as an ordinary invitation. Another detail deserves consideration. By this stage of the story, many years had passed since the death of Saul and Jonathan. David's reign was firmly established. Jerusalem functioned as the administrative center of the kingdom. The major struggles associated with the transfer of power had largely ended. From a practical perspective, there was little reason for David to concern himself with a disabled descendant of Saul living far from the capital. That fact alone makes the king's actions noteworthy. Something motivated David to revisit a relationship that belonged to an earlier generation. The answer, as readers already know, lay in his friendship with Jonathan. Mephibosheth, however, had not yet heard David's explanation. All he knew was that the king wanted to see him. The journey from Lodabar to Jerusalem likely covered a considerable distance and would have required time to complete. Although Scripture offers no description of the trip itself, the movement carries symbolic importance within the narrative. For years, Mephibosheth had lived beyond the political spotlight. Now, he was traveling toward the very place where national decisions were made. The route connected two dramatically different worlds. Lodabar represented the margins of the kingdom. Jerusalem represented its center. One was associated with relative obscurity. The other was the seat of royal authority. By responding to David's summons, Mephibosheth crossed that divide. When he finally arrived, the biblical text records his immediate reaction. He fell on his face before the king. Such behavior reflected standard protocol in royal courts throughout the ancient world. Physical gestures of respect communicated recognition of status and authority. The scene, therefore, begins in a manner that ancient audiences would have recognized instantly. A subject stands before the ruler of the nation. Yet, this particular encounter contained an unusual historical dimension. The man bowing before David belonged to the family that once occupied Israel's throne. The king receiving him was the man who had succeeded that family. Their meeting brought together two chapters of Israel's history that had previously remained separate. One represented the legacy of Saul. The other represented the kingdom David had built. At this point, the narrative slows noticeably. The reader knows why David initiated the meeting, but Mephibosheth does not. The tension arises not from hidden danger, but from hidden purpose. David's intentions remain unrevealed until he chooses to speak. The first words he addresses to Jonathan's son, therefore, carry enormous weight. Before discussing property, inheritance, land, or status, David addresses the uncertainty surrounding the meeting itself. He tells Mephibosheth not to fear. The statement functions as more than reassurance. It immediately clarifies the direction of the conversation. This is not a judicial hearing. It is not an interrogation. It is not the settling of an old political score. David's words signal that something entirely different is about to occur. The meeting that began with a royal summons is about to become one of the most unexpected acts recorded in the reign of David. For years, Mephibosheth had lived with the consequences of a battle fought before he could influence history. What he could not know while traveling toward Jerusalem was that the next phase of his life would not be determined by the fall of Saul's dynasty. It would be determined by a promise that David still remembered. The meeting, recorded in 2 Samuel 9, occupies only a small portion of the biblical text, yet it stands among the most remarkable scenes in the reign of David. For the first time since the fall of Saul's dynasty, A surviving member of the former royal house stood face to face with the king who now ruled Israel. The encounter brought together two family histories that had once appeared destined for conflict. On one side was the grandson of Saul, carrying the legacy of a dynasty that had collapsed years earlier. On the other was the ruler whose kingdom had emerged from that transition. Ancient audiences would have understood the significance immediately. Encounters of this kind rarely ended with restoration. More often, they confirmed the final disappearance of the previous regime. Instead, the conversation moved in an entirely different direction. David began by removing the uncertainty surrounding the meeting. He informed Mephibosheth that his intentions were rooted in his relationship with Jonathan. The statement connected the present moment to commitments made decades earlier. Before battles, political upheaval, and changes in royal power had reshaped Israel's history. The years had altered almost everything around them, but they had not erased David's memory of Jonathan. What followed was not a negotiation, a political arrangement, or a discussion of competing claims. It was the fulfillment of an obligation David believed still mattered. The first major element of that fulfillment involved land. According to the biblical account, the property that had belonged to Saul's family would be restored to Mephibosheth. To modern readers, land is often viewed primarily as real estate or financial assets. In the ancient world, its significance extended much further. Land represented inheritance, economic stability, family continuity, and social standing. It connected individuals to their ancestors and provided the foundation upon which future generations could build their lives. The restoration of Saul's estate therefore carried practical and symbolic importance. It reestablished a legal and economic connection between Mephibosheth and the heritage that had been disrupted after Mount Gilboa. The arrangement included more than ownership. The land required management, cultivation, and labor. To address those needs, responsibility was assigned to Ziba and his household. Their role was to work the estate and ensure its productivity. This detail demonstrates that the restoration was designed to function in everyday life, rather than exist merely as a ceremonial gesture. The biblical narrative consistently presents the decision as something concrete and sustainable. Resources were being restored, but so was long-term security. At this point in the story, readers encounter one of the most revealing responses ever spoken by Mephibosheth. Overwhelmed by what he was hearing, he bowed and asked why the king would show concern for someone like him, describing himself as a dead dog. The expression reflects the language of humility commonly found in the ancient Near East, but it also provides insight into how Mephibosheth viewed his own position. He was not approaching David as a political rival. He was not appealing to family status or demanding inherited rights. His words suggest surprise that such attention was being directed toward him at all. Years earlier, he had been carried away from the center of power as a vulnerable child. Since then, he had lived through circumstances that offered little reason to expect royal favor. The contrast between his self-perception and the treatment he received becomes one of the defining features of the narrative. Yet, the most memorable aspect of David's decision involved neither land nor administration. Mephibosheth was informed that he would eat regularly at the king's table. This detail appears repeatedly within the chapter, indicating that the narrator considered it especially important. In royal courts throughout the ancient world, meals carried social meaning. They were not simply occasions for nourishment. Seating arrangements reflected status. Invitations reflected acceptance. Access reflected relationship. To sit at a ruler's table was to occupy a recognized place within a particular social world, and David was therefore offering more than hospitality. He was extending inclusion. The grandson of Saul would not remain a distant beneficiary of royal generosity. He would become a visible participant within the life of the court. This development helps explain why many scholars draw attention to the Hebrew concept, often translated as steadfast love, loyal kindness, or covenant faithfulness. The word hesed appears frequently in discussions of this chapter because it captures a pattern of behavior grounded in enduring commitment rather than immediate advantage. David's actions produced no obvious political benefit. If anything, honoring a descendant of Saul ran against common expectations associated with dynastic transitions in the ancient world. The decision makes the most sense when viewed through the lens of remembered loyalty. Jonathan had once protected David during a period of danger. Years later, David chose to extend that same faithfulness to Jonathan's son. The significance of the moment extends beyond the details of property and privilege. For Mephibosheth, this meeting altered the trajectory of a life shaped by events beyond his control. The child injured during a hurried escape now found himself welcomed into the presence of the king. The years spent in Lo-debar no longer defined his future. The grandson of a fallen ruler was no longer known primarily through the catastrophe that had overtaken his family. A new chapter had begun. Not because political circumstances changed, but because a promise survived long enough to reach the next generation. The restoration described in 2 Samuel 9 did not erase the past. Saul remained dead. Jonathan remained gone. The injury suffered in childhood remained part of Mephibosheth's life. What changed was his place within the story. For the first time since Mount Gilboa, the narrative moves away from survival and toward belonging. The years ahead would bring new challenges. But for now, the former exile of Lo-debar had been given something he could not have secured for himself, a place within the household of the king. The restoration described in 2 Samuel 9 solved several practical problems in Mephibosheth's life. Property had been returned. Economic security had been established. A place within the royal household had been granted. Yet the most significant change may have occurred at a deeper level. The biblical narrative invites readers to consider not only what Mephibosheth received, but also how his position within society was fundamentally redefined. For many years, his identity had been shaped by circumstances he did not choose. He was known as the grandson of a defeated king. He was remembered as the child injured during a hurried escape after Mount Gilboa. He lived far from the centers of power that once belonged to his family. Each of these realities influenced how others likely viewed him, and perhaps how he viewed himself. The events recorded in David's court introduced a new framework through which his life would be understood. One of the most important social realities of the ancient Near East was the connection between status and identity. Individuals were often defined by family lineage, social position, economic standing, and relationships to powerful households. Modern cultures frequently emphasize personal achievement and individual self-definition. Ancient societies operated differently. Belonging mattered. Family mattered. Public recognition mattered. The question of where a person fit within the social structure could influence nearly every aspect of life. In that environment, David's treatment of Mephibosheth carried implications extending far beyond material generosity. The king publicly altered the way Jonathan's son was positioned within the kingdom. The biblical text repeatedly notes that Mephibosheth ate at the king's table like one of the king's sons. The significance of this statement is not primarily about meals. It concerns association. Throughout history, powerful rulers have often communicated favor through proximity. The individuals granted access to a ruler's presence were visibly distinguished from the wider population. Their inclusion signaled trust, acceptance, and recognized standing. By placing Mephibosheth within that environment, David changed how the former exile related to the social world around him. He was no longer living on the margins of the kingdom. He now occupied a place connected directly to its center, Another important dimension involves the culture of honor and shame that shaped much of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. In such societies, public reputation carried enormous weight. Honor functioned as a form of social currency, while shame could result in exclusion and diminished standing. The fall of Saul's dynasty had dramatically altered the status of Jonathan's family. Political defeat often brought lasting consequences for surviving descendants. The restoration initiated by David therefore involved more than legal rights. It also represented a public act of honor. The grandson of Saul was no longer defined solely by the downfall of his family. His place within the royal household communicated a different message. He was recognized, protected, and respected under the authority of the king. This perspective helps explain why Mephibosheth's own words in the previous chapter are so revealing. When he referred to himself as a dead dog, he expressed an understanding of his position that reflected years of diminished expectations. Whether the statement arose from humility, gratitude, or awareness of political realities, it reveals a man who did not approach David with assumptions of entitlement. The contrast between that self-description and the treatment he subsequently received forms one of the central tensions within the story. The narrative moves from low status to restored honor, from vulnerability to security, and from exclusion to inclusion. These themes are not unique to Mephibosheth. They appear throughout biblical literature in various forms, which may help explain why his story has remained so memorable for generations of readers. There is also a practical aspect to this transformation. Life in Jerusalem exposed Mephibosheth to a world very different from Lo-Debar. The capital served as the administrative, political, and religious center of the kingdom. Decisions affecting the nation were made there. Military leaders, officials, advisors, and members of the royal household interacted there. Although Scripture does not describe Mephibosheth participating directly in governmental affairs, his presence within that environment represented a significant change from the isolation that characterized much of his earlier life. The shift illustrates how quickly social realities can change when relationships change. Circumstances that once appeared permanent may not remain so indefinitely. The narrative also briefly introduces another generation. We learn that Mephibosheth had a son named Micah. The detail occupies only a small portion of the text, yet it carries historical significance. The family line of Jonathan continued. The story was no longer focused solely on survival after a dynastic collapse. It now included continuity into the future. For ancient readers, family continuity represented an important marker of stability and hope. The destruction that followed Mount Gilboa had not erased Jonathan's descendants from history. Looking across this stage of Mephibosheth's life, a broader pattern becomes visible. The defining feature of his story is not political ambition, military achievement, or personal power. Instead, it is the way relationships repeatedly shape his future. The friendship between David and Jonathan influences events long after Jonathan's death. The hospitality of Machir provides protection during years of obscurity. David's decision creates opportunities that Mephibosheth could never have secured independently. His story, therefore, serves as a reminder that human lives are often shaped not only by individual choices, but also by commitments, loyalties, and acts of faithfulness extending across generations. For a time, this restored identity appeared secure. The kingdom was stable. David's authority remained strong. The years of exile belonged to the past. Yet political stability in the ancient world could never be taken for granted. A crisis was already beginning to emerge within David's own household, and its consequences would soon reach every corner of the kingdom. When that crisis erupted, questions of loyalty, reputation, and trust would once again become central to Mephibosheth's story. For many years, David's kingdom appeared stable. The political struggles that followed Saul's death had been resolved. Jerusalem had become the capital, and Israel had expanded its influence throughout the region. From the perspective of national history, David's reign represented one of the strongest periods of unity the kingdom had yet experienced. For Mephibosheth, those same years marked a dramatic departure from the instability that had defined his childhood. He was no longer living in Lo-debar. His place within the royal household had been established. The uncertainties associated with the fall of Saul's dynasty seemed increasingly distant. Yet the greatest threat to David's rule would not come from foreign armies or rival kingdoms. It would emerge from within his own family. The rise of Absalom forms one of the most complex political narratives in the books of Samuel. Unlike external enemies who challenged Israel from beyond its borders, Absalom possessed something far more dangerous. He possessed legitimacy. As a son of David, he belonged to the royal family itself. He also possessed personal qualities that attracted public attention. The biblical text repeatedly emphasizes his appearance, popularity, and ability to gain support among the people. These characteristics alone do not explain the rebellion. However, the broader narrative suggests that unresolved tensions within David's household created conditions that Absalom was able to exploit. Personal grievances gradually evolved into political ambitions, and political ambitions eventually developed into organized opposition. One of the most revealing aspects of Absalom's strategy was its patience. Rather than immediately attempting to seize power through force, he spent years cultivating influence. According to 2 Samuel 15, he positioned himself near the city gate, a place where legal disputes and public concerns were commonly discussed. There, he listened to grievances, expressed sympathy, and implied that the existing administration was failing to address the needs of ordinary people. The biblical writer summarizes the result with a striking statement: Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Whether viewed through a political or historical lens, the observation highlights an important reality. Revolutions rarely succeed through military strength alone. They succeed when significant portions of a population become willing to support alternative leadership. Eventually, the movement became strong enough for Absalom to act openly. What began as influence transformed into rebellion. Supporters gathered around him, alliances formed, and the challenge to David's authority became impossible to ignore. The situation developed so rapidly that David concluded remaining in Jerusalem would expose the city to unnecessary destruction. Rather than forcing a battle within the capital, he chose to leave. The decision reveals both the seriousness of the crisis and David's assessment of the danger. This was not a minor disturbance. It was a direct threat to the continuity of the kingdom. The image of David departing Jerusalem carries profound historical significance. Years earlier, he had entered the city as a conquering king, establishing it as the center of a united Israel. Now, he departed under dramatically different circumstances, surrounded by loyal followers. He crossed the Kidron Valley and moved eastward, while uncertainty spread throughout the nation. The moment echoes earlier chapters of David's life when he fled from Saul, yet the emotional context was different. This time, the challenge came from his own son. For the population of Israel, the rebellion created a period of intense uncertainty. Questions that had once seemed settled suddenly returned. Who would rule the kingdom? Which leaders could be trusted? Which alliances would endure? Political crises have a way of exposing loyalties that remain hidden during stable periods. Individuals who appear committed under normal circumstances may respond differently when power shifts. Others demonstrate unexpected faithfulness when tested. Throughout history, moments of instability have often revealed character more clearly than years of peace. This broader context is essential for understanding what happens next in Mephibosheth's story. During ordinary times, misunderstandings can be investigated carefully, evidence can be gathered, witnesses can be questioned, reputations develop gradually. Rebellions create different conditions. Information becomes fragmented. Decisions must be made quickly. Rumors spread faster than facts. Leaders often act before they possess complete knowledge. David now found himself operating under exactly those circumstances. He was no longer governing from the security of Jerusalem. He was managing a national emergency while moving through unfamiliar territory with an uncertain future. Every report mattered. Every expression of loyalty mattered. Every relationship carried political implications. For Mephibosheth, this changing environment introduced risks he had not faced since childhood. His family history linked him to Israel's former royal dynasty. Under normal conditions, that connection attracted little attention. During a succession crisis, however, perceptions could change rapidly. The grandson of Saul occupied a position that others might interpret in different ways, depending on their own ambitions, fears, or assumptions. The stability that had defined his life in Jerusalem rested upon a kingdom now facing one of its greatest tests. As David continued his journey away from the capital, he relied increasingly on the information provided by those who came to meet him along the road. Some arrived to offer assistance. Others brought news from Jerusalem. Among those individuals was a familiar figure from Mephibosheth's household. The conversation that followed would reshape David's understanding of Jonathan's son and set in motion one of the most debated episodes in the entire narrative. As David moved away from Jerusalem during Absalom's rebellion, he encountered a steady stream of individuals bringing supplies, intelligence, and reports from different parts of the kingdom. In times of political upheaval, information becomes a strategic resource. Armies require food. Leaders require reliable allies. And every piece of news can influence critical decisions. It is within this setting that Ziba reappears in the biblical narrative. Readers first met him in 2 Samuel 9 as a servant associated with Saul's household. After David restored Saul's estate to Mephibosheth, Ziba and his family were assigned responsibility for cultivating the land and managing its resources. His position placed him in a unique relationship with both Mephibosheth and the royal administration. During Absalom's rebellion, that position suddenly became much more significant. According to 2 Samuel 16, Ziba arrived carrying provisions for David and the group accompanying him. The supplies included donkeys, bread, fruit, and wine, resources that would have been valuable to people traveling under difficult circumstances. The gesture immediately distinguished Ziba from many others whose loyalties remained uncertain during the rebellion. At a moment when David needed practical support, Ziba appeared willing to provide it. The encounter might have ended there, had David not noticed an important absence. Mephibosheth was nowhere to be seen. The omission was striking because readers already know the history between David and Jonathan's son. Years earlier, David had restored his inheritance, welcomed him into the royal household, and publicly honored him. Under ordinary circumstances, the absence might not have attracted special attention. During a succession crisis, however, loyalties carried enormous political weight. David therefore asked a straightforward question: where was Mephibosheth? Ziba's answer transformed a simple inquiry into one of the most debated episodes in the story. He claimed that Mephibosheth had remained in Jerusalem because he believed the turmoil created by Absalom's rebellion would provide an opportunity for Saul's dynasty to regain power. According to this version of events, Jonathan's son was waiting to see whether the kingdom might return to the family from which it had originally passed. The accusation was serious because it challenged the very foundation of Mephibosheth's relationship with David. If true, it would suggest that years of apparent loyalty concealed political ambition. If false, it represented a profound act of deception. One reason the accusation deserves careful attention is that it was not inherently impossible. Mephibosheth belonged to the family of Israel's first king. His lineage connected him directly to a former royal house. Throughout ancient history, periods of instability often encouraged dormant claims to authority. Individuals with royal ancestry could become symbols around which dissatisfied factions gathered, even when they had little practical ability to seize power themselves. From a purely political perspective, Ziba's story possessed a degree of plausibility. It reflected patterns visible throughout the ancient world. This helps explain why the accusation could not be dismissed automatically. At the same time, the narrative presents several factors that invite caution. Readers have already seen Mephibosheth respond to David's kindness with humility rather than entitlement. Nothing in his earlier portrayal suggests an active desire to pursue power. The biblical account also reveals that Ziba stood to benefit materially if Mephibosheth's position were weakened. As manager of Saul's estate, he occupied a position from which personal advantage was possible. This observation does not prove dishonesty, but it does introduce an important question regarding motive. Historical sources frequently remind us that periods of political uncertainty create opportunities for ambitious individuals. Whether Ziba was acting out of loyalty, self-interest, or some combination of both, remains one of the central questions raised by the text. Another feature of the narrative deserves notice. At this stage, only one voice is heard. Mephibosheth is absent. No witnesses are introduced, no additional testimony is provided. Readers receive information exactly as David received it, through the report of a single individual. The structure is significant because it places the audience in the same position occupied by the king. We are asked to evaluate a claim without possessing the complete picture. Rather than guiding readers toward an immediate conclusion, the narrative creates uncertainty that will remain unresolved until later chapters. David's response was swift. After hearing Ziba's report, he declared that the estate previously assigned to Mephibosheth would now belong to Ziba. The decision dramatically altered the balance of the situation. Property, influence, and economic resources shifted from one man to another on the basis of information that had not yet been challenged. Ziba accepted the ruling and expressed loyalty to the king. From his perspective, the encounter ended favorably. For David, the matter may have appeared resolved. For readers, however, the episode raises more questions than answers. The absence of Mephibosheth becomes increasingly important precisely because his version of events has not yet been heard. This tension is one reason the story continues to attract scholarly discussion. The biblical text does not immediately reveal whether David's judgment was correct. Instead, it allows uncertainty to remain. As the king continued moving through a nation divided by rebellion, he carried with him a new understanding of Jonathan's son. Whether that understanding reflected reality would only become clear after the crisis had passed and another meeting took place. When Mephibosheth finally appeared again, the account he offered would challenge almost every assumption created by Ziba's accusation. Absalom's rebellion ultimately failed. The military campaign ended. The challenge to David's authority collapsed, and the kingdom began the difficult process of recovery. Like many civil conflicts throughout history, however, the conclusion of the fighting did not immediately resolve every question created by the crisis. Political loyalties had been tested, relationships had been strained. Decisions made during the emergency now had to be reconsidered in light of new information. Among the unresolved matters awaiting David was the accusation brought by Ziba against Mephibosheth. The next time Jonathan's son appears in the biblical narrative, the circumstances are dramatically different from those described in 2 Samuel 9. The confident stability of life within the royal household has been replaced by controversy. According to 2 Samuel 19, Mephibosheth came to meet David as the king returned toward Jerusalem, before he spoke a single word. The text draws attention to his appearance. We are told that he had not cared for his feet, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes from the day David departed until the day he returned safely. Ancient readers would have recognized the significance of these details. Such behavior was commonly associated with mourning, distress, or prolonged personal grief. The description, therefore, creates an immediate contrast with the image presented by Ziba. Rather than appearing as someone quietly celebrating a political opportunity, Mephibosheth appears as a man visibly affected by the king's absence. At this point, David addressed the question that had remained unresolved since the beginning of the rebellion. Why had Mephibosheth not accompanied him when he fled Jerusalem? The answer introduced an entirely different account of events. According to Mephibosheth, he had intended to go with the king because of his disability. However, he depended on others for transportation. He explained that he instructed his servant to prepare a donkey so that he could travel with David. Instead, he claimed that Ziba abandoned him, and then used the situation to misrepresent him before the king. The accusation that had previously been directed toward Mephibosheth was now redirected toward Ziba. The narrative suddenly presents two competing explanations for the same event. This is where the story becomes especially interesting from a historical perspective. Many biblical narratives clearly identify heroes and villains. This episode does not. The writer provides both testimonies while withholding a direct verdict. As a result, readers are placed in the position of evaluating evidence rather than simply receiving conclusions. Several observations have influenced scholarly discussion over the centuries. Those who believe Mephibosheth's account often point first to his appearance. His condition appears difficult to reconcile with the image of a man anticipating personal political gain. They also note the consistency between his behavior in earlier chapters and his defense before David. Previously, he showed little indication of ambition and responded to royal favor with humility rather than entitlement. Additionally, Ziba benefited directly from David's earlier ruling. The transfer of property created an obvious incentive that scholars frequently consider when assessing the credibility of his testimony. Others approach the evidence more cautiously. They observe that the biblical author never explicitly states that Ziba lied. While Mephibosheth's explanation appears persuasive, the narrative stops short of providing definitive confirmation. Responsible historical analysis must acknowledge that silence. Historians often work with incomplete records, conflicting testimony, and evidence that does not answer every question. The account in 2 Samuel presents exactly that kind of challenge. Readers may find one interpretation more convincing than another, but the text itself leaves room for continued debate. This ambiguity may be intentional. Throughout Scripture, not every dispute receives a perfectly clear resolution. Human relationships are often more complicated than simple categories of innocence and guilt. Competing narratives emerge, motives remain partially hidden, and certainty proves difficult to achieve. The episode involving Ziba and Mephibosheth reflects that reality in a way that feels surprisingly modern. The challenge is not merely determining what happened. The challenge is evaluating testimony when each participant possesses reasons to defend his own position. Another detail within Mephibosheth's response deserves attention. As he spoke to David, he acknowledged the extraordinary kindness previously shown to him. He reminded the king that the descendants of Saul might reasonably have expected a far harsher fate following the transfer of power. Instead, David had granted him a place among those who ate at the royal table. This observation serves an important narrative function. Rather than arguing from entitlement, Mephibosheth argues from gratitude. He presents himself not as a claimant seeking greater authority, but as a recipient of generosity already received. Whether readers ultimately accept his account or remain uncertain, The tone of his defense contributes significantly to the portrait the narrative presents. By the conclusion of the conversation, the central issue remained unresolved. David now possessed two incompatible explanations. One had come from Ziba during the rebellion. The other came directly from Mephibosheth after the rebellion ended. Each carried elements that could not be dismissed easily. The biblical author offers no hidden witness, no additional testimony, and no miraculous revelation that settles the matter beyond dispute. Instead, the story pauses at precisely the point where certainty would be most welcome. This narrative choice shifts attention away from discovering a perfect answer and toward a different question. Faced with competing accounts and incomplete evidence, how should a king respond? The answer David provided would become one of the most discussed judgments in the latter years of his reign, and would reveal both the responsibilities and the limitations of leadership in a world where the full truth is not always accessible. The meeting between David and Mephibosheth resolved one problem while leaving another unanswered. The king had finally heard a second account of the events that occurred during Absalom's rebellion. Yet the competing explanations did not produce a simple conclusion. The biblical text records David's response in remarkably few words, rather than reopening the entire dispute or pursuing a lengthy investigation. He instructed that the land be divided between Ziba and Mephibosheth. The brevity of the decision stands in contrast to the complexity of the situation. Readers are given no detailed explanation of David's reasoning, which is one reason the passage has generated discussion for centuries. Because the text does not explicitly explain the king's thought process. Several interpretations have emerged. Some scholars view the ruling as a practical compromise. Under this interpretation, David recognized that the dispute could not be resolved with complete confidence, and therefore chose a solution that avoided fully endorsing either side. Others suggest that broader political considerations may have influenced the decision. The kingdom had only recently survived a rebellion. National reconciliation remained fragile. Publicly reversing earlier actions could have created additional complications during a period when stability was still being restored. A third perspective argues that David may have recognized weaknesses in Ziba's original accusation, while remaining reluctant to undo a judgment already issued during the crisis. Each interpretation attempts to explain the same outcome, yet none can be proven conclusively, because the biblical writer leaves the king's motives largely unstated. This narrative restraint is significant. Ancient historical writing often focuses more on actions than internal explanations. Readers are shown what David decided, but they are not given direct access to every factor that shaped the decision. As a result, the passage continues to invite analysis rather than settling every question. What can be stated with confidence is that the ruling did not fully restore the situation that existed before Absalom's rebellion. Something had changed. Trust had been tested, accusations had been made, and uncertainty had entered a relationship that once appeared straightforward. At this point, however, the narrative shifts attention away from the king and toward Mephibosheth. His response becomes one of the most revealing moments in the entire story. After hearing David's decision, he declared that Ziba could take everything, provided the king had returned safely in peace. The statement is brief, yet its implications are substantial. Throughout the dispute, property had been a central issue. Land ownership, inheritance rights, and economic resources all stood at stake. A person primarily motivated by wealth would naturally focus on recovering what had been lost. Mephibosheth's response moves in a different direction. Rather than negotiating for a larger share, he expresses satisfaction that David has returned safely to Jerusalem. For many interpreters, this reaction becomes one of the strongest pieces of evidence regarding his character. The statement does not function as a legal argument. It functions as a window into priorities. Earlier chapters introduced Mephibosheth as a survivor of dynastic collapse. a man whose life had been shaped by events beyond his control. Later chapters showed him receiving unexpected restoration through David's kindness. Now, during a dispute involving property and reputation, his attention appears fixed elsewhere. The safe return of the king matters more than material gain. Whether readers view this as proof of innocence or simply evidence of personal loyalty, the response remains striking. It does not sound like the language of political ambition. It sounds like the language of someone who values a relationship above an inheritance. The contrast becomes even more apparent when viewed against the broader backdrop of the books of Samuel. Much of the narrative revolves around questions of power, succession, authority, and competing claims. Saul struggled to preserve his throne. Absalom attempted to seize one. Military leaders fought to secure influence within a changing kingdom. Against that background, Mephibosheth occupies an unusual place in the story. Although he possessed a connection to a former royal dynasty, the biblical narrative never portrays him actively pursuing political power. Instead, his most memorable moments involve receiving mercy, demonstrating humility, and expressing gratitude. These characteristics help explain why his story has remained so influential despite the relatively small number of verses devoted to his life. The unresolved nature of the dispute also contributes to the narrative's enduring appeal. Modern readers often expect historical accounts to provide definitive answers. The story of Ziba and Mephibosheth does not fully satisfy that expectation. Important questions remain open. Did Ziba manipulate the situation for personal gain? Did David suspect more than he openly acknowledged? Was the final ruling primarily political, practical, or judicial? The text does not settle these debates. Instead, it preserves the ambiguity. Far from weakening the story, this ambiguity gives it a realism that many readers recognize immediately. Human conflicts rarely conclude with perfect clarity. Motives remain partially hidden. Evidence remains incomplete. Decisions must still be made. The account reflects that reality without attempting to eliminate it. By the end of this chapter, the controversy itself begins to fade into the background. The estate has been divided. The rebellion has ended. David has returned to Jerusalem. What remains is the larger question of how Mephibosheth should be remembered. Is he primarily a victim of political circumstances, a beneficiary of David's faithfulness, a symbol of restored honor, a case study in loyalty under pressure? The final chapter will step back from individual disputes and examine the broader legacy of a man whose life intersected with some of the most significant events in Israel's early monarchy, leaving an impact far greater than the limited number of biblical verses might initially suggest. When the biblical narrative moves beyond the reign of David, Mephibosheth largely disappears from the historical record. The scriptures provide no detailed account of his final years, no description of his death, and no extended discussion of what became of him after the events surrounding Absalom's rebellion. This silence is not unusual. Many figures who play important roles in biblical history eventually pass out of view once their contribution to the larger narrative has been completed. Yet the absence of additional information raises an interesting question. Why has Mephibosheth remained one of the most remembered secondary characters in the books of Samuel, despite occupying relatively little space within the text itself? Part of the answer lies in the extraordinary historical setting through which his life unfolded. Few individuals stood at the intersection of so many significant events. He was born into Israel's first royal dynasty. He lost his father and grandfather during one of the most consequential military defeats in the nation's history. He lived through the transfer of power from Saul's house to David's. He experienced years beyond the political center of the kingdom before unexpectedly returning to it. Later, He found himself caught in the turmoil of another succession crisis during Absalom's rebellion. His personal story repeatedly intersects with turning points that shape the future of Israel. In that sense, Mephibosheth serves as a unique witness to the transformation of the monarchy itself. His life also provides valuable insight into realities that are often overlooked when studying kings, generals, and political leaders. Much of history is written from the perspective of those who exercise power. Mephibosheth represents a different perspective. He experienced the consequences of decisions made by others. The battle at Mount Gilboa altered his future before he was old enough to influence events. Political transitions affected where he lived and how he was perceived. Accusations made during a national crisis threatened his reputation. Through his story, readers are reminded that major historical developments are not experienced only by rulers. They are also experienced by ordinary families, vulnerable individuals, and people whose lives are reshaped by forces beyond their control. Another reason the narrative continues to attract attention involves its portrayal of loyalty across generations. The friendship between David and Jonathan occupies only part of the larger biblical story. Yet, its effects extend far beyond the lifetimes of the two men who established it. Years after Jonathan's death, David's memory of that relationship influenced decisions that altered the future of Jonathan's son. Historians studying the ancient Near East frequently observe that family alliances, obligations, and personal commitments often played significant roles in political life. The story of Mephibosheth offers a particularly vivid example of that reality. A promise made during one generation continued to shape events in the next. The account is equally interesting from a literary perspective because it refuses to resolve every question. Readers naturally want certainty regarding the dispute between Ziba and Mephibosheth. Many form strong opinions about which version of events appears most credible. Yet the biblical writer never provides an explicit verdict. The ambiguity remains part of the story, rather than weakening the narrative. This feature has helped sustain discussion for centuries. It invites readers to weigh evidence, consider motives, and recognize the limits of historical knowledge. In this respect, the account resembles many real historical investigations, in which available sources illuminate important details while leaving other questions unanswered. Theological interpretation adds another layer to Mephibosheth's legacy. It is important to distinguish carefully between what the text directly states and how later readers have understood it. Historically, the central event of the narrative is David's decision to show kindness to Jonathan's son because of a prior commitment. That is the immediate context presented in the books of Samuel. Jewish and Christian interpreters, however, have often viewed the story as illustrating broader themes related to faithfulness, mercy, and remembered promises. These interpretations move beyond the strictly historical level of analysis, yet they help explain why Mephibosheth continues to appear in sermons, theological discussions, and religious literature long after many other figures from the same period have faded from public memory. Looking across the entire narrative, perhaps the most striking feature is the contrast between how Mephibosheth entered the story and how he is remembered. He first appears as a child, carried away from disaster during the collapse of a kingdom. The defining event of his early life was an accident that left him physically disabled. For many historical figures, such beginnings would have marked the end of their significance. Instead, those circumstances became the starting point of a journey that carried him through exile, restoration, controversy, and survival. He never became a king. He never commanded an army. No military victories are attached to his name. Yet, his story endured, while many more powerful figures became little more than names in genealogies. Perhaps that endurance explains why readers continue returning to the account. Mephibosheth occupies a rare place in biblical history. He is neither a great ruler nor a major prophet. He is not remembered for conquest, wealth, or political achievement. He is remembered because his life reveals what history often overlooks: the experience of a man living in the shadow of kings while navigating the consequences of promises, loyalties, and decisions made long before he understood their significance. When the story closes, the image that remains is not a throne, a battlefield, or a royal decree. It is the image of Jonathan's son, once hidden in Lodabar and nearly lost to history, finding a place within a story far larger than his own.